Okay, we're going to begin. One moment. Good morning and welcome everyone to our program live from Israel today. My name is Gail Kurtzman, and on behalf of the Israel Affairs Committee and Adult Education, I would like to thank you for joining us as we welcome back journalist Lauren Izso with special guest Michal CotlerWunsh as they discuss last week's Israeli election. Just a reminder, this program will be recorded, so if you don't want to be on camera, please turn off your video. And as usual, if you have questions, please direct them in the chat. I would now like to introduce our interviewer for today, Lauren. Lauren is a TV host and international news reporter and journalist based in Tel Aviv. She was born in Toronto and studied at UBC Ryerson and Tel Aviv University. She has worked at I-24 News, the Jerusalem Post, and now is a freelancer working with CNN, CBC, TRT, RT, and Newsmax. And in the last few months, she has returned to hosting and reporting local Israeli news. Lauren will be interviewing our special guest, Michal CotlerWunsh. Michal is a member of the Knesset and sits on many committees and is chair of the subcommittee on Israel Diaspora Relations and the Canada-Israel Friendship Group. She was born in Israel, but grew up in Montreal. She received her law degree from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and her master's of law from McGill. And now she's working towards her PhD in the area of human rights. Of course, I need to mention that she is the daughter of the Honorable Erwin Cotler, who has spoken many times at Beth Tikva. And before I hand it over to Lauren, I'd just like if you both could update us on what is the situation in Israel with respect to the pandemic and how Israelis were able to celebrate Passover this year, because I think many of us were quite jealous here in Canada. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
Sure. As you said, we're basically the only place in the world right now that we could have a normal Passover Seder with our families. So I think that was a really special experience for everyone in Israel because, of course, our vaccine campaign is really, really strong. We've vaccinated so much of our population. The numbers are really, really starting to go down. I think yesterday we saw the least amount of new cases since December, I believe. So we're really heading in a good trajectory. They actually announced today that there was an Israeli mutation discovered that may have been as a result of the vaccines, but they also went ahead and said, this mutation is not dangerous. The vaccines are effective against it, and we don't need to worry about it. So far, so good. It looks like we're really, really possibly heading out of this thing. I mean, if you ask Netanyahu, we're definitely out of this thing already, but obviously we have to wait and see. Michal, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what's going on from your perspective.
So first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for having us. Chag Sameach, Moadim L'Simcha. We're in a particularly joyous celebration of Pesach. And when you think of, the perspective, thousands of years of the journey from slavery to freedom and what COVID-19 has meant for so much of us all over the world, then what Lauren says has been in particular appreciated, I think, here in Israel. The fact that we could have Seders with our families, the fact that though children are not yet vaccinated, the majority of adults in the country are vaccinated. The fact that we're looking at sort of the day beyond COVID-19 has been really, with the tremendous sense of, as I said, gratitude and appreciation. I mean, at this point, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit further on, but I think different countries have had the benefits, or I'd say the opportunity alongside the tremendous challenge of COVID-19, and the benefits are now. So presumably, if we identify the important challenges that each of our countries have, in Israel's case, we can talk about some of those challenges. And I don't mean the politics at all. I mean education and healthcare, mental health, and issues that, for many years were probably festering. But COVID-19, while it didn't invent anything, exposed, highlighted the challenges that we face as societies, I think that that's where, what lies ahead of us is a tremendous opportunity that comes alongside it. And maybe we'll discuss that a little bit later on. I just want to say again, thank you very much for having me. And I appreciate very much. And every time I talk to communities in Canada, of course, I feel a little bit of a taste of home, and it's particularly meaningful to engage with you, with your community on Pesach. So thanks.
All right. Yeah. And of course, Chag Sameach to everyone. I didn't mention that. And thank you, of course, for having me again. It's really a pleasure and an honor to speak to you guys. I'm really happy to be joining you again, especially here with Michal today. So thank you, Michal, for being a part of this. So before we get to the elections, which obviously there's a lot to talk about, we've had our 4th election in 2 years. I do want to touch a little bit on your connection to Canada, growing up in the Canadian Jewish community, what that means to you, how it shaped who you are, and how it brought you to what you're doing now.
So thank you, Lauren. Thank you for that question, because in fact, it's probably the most important element of the way that I served in Knesset. And I have to tell everybody here, while we're accustomed in Canada to have sort of constituencies, and in that way, our representatives, our elected representatives, service that constituency. That isn't really the practice in Israel because of the electoral system here. That's very, very different. However, what you've just mentioned, Lauren, the fact that I grew up in Montreal, in addition or on top of everything else, and due to the COVID-19 challenges, actually was very, very instructive in the way that I served the public, in the way that I served a constituency. My office knew to respond to thousands of emails and phone calls, and actually became the address for what we call Olim, whether they've been here for 20 years or 2 years, because of the specific challenges that Olim faced with regards to not being able to see families for the better part of the last year, specific challenges of lone soldiers, of Bnot Shirut that are in this country alone, and that has really been very, very instructive in the way that I've served. On the sort of content piece, so for those that don't know me, I as mentioned, was born in Jerusalem, but grew up in Montreal, attended high school in Montreal, and then moved to Israel, served as a lone soldier, and went to law school at Hebrew University, but returned to Montreal actually to pursue my master's in law, and then was there for 10 years, and actually have 4 Canadian children who were brought to Israel. We brought to Israel 10 years ago. So really the back and forth has informed what I call the multiplicity of identities. I think that it's very, very important that we realize, in terms of the understanding of the state of Israel, the external perspective of Israel's challenges, or looking at those challenges from the outside, brings a very, very important understanding, both to Israel's challenges in the international arena, certainly to Israel diaspora relations, and also in terms of Israel's internal resiliency. I think that specifically as a Canadian, the understanding of what multicultural societies look like, the understanding of the importance of bringing our identities actually not into a melting pot culture, but into a mosaic culture. And the imperative for us, and I've been, as I said, very, very honored to represent the voices of Olim, specifically Anglo-Olim, the imperative for us to lean in and sit around the decision-making tables to inform the processes, the decision-making processes, with the insights, with the experiences that we bring with us, whether it be because we come from very seasoned democracies and come with those experiences of understanding democracy in terms of the imperative for transparency and accountability and good governance and long-term holistic planning that is implemented equally and consistently towards all. Those are really fundamental issues that task the state of Israel as it approaches its 73rd year, and also in terms of its Jewish identity. So having emigrated to the state of Israel because of Israel's being a Jewish and democratic, not one or the other, not a democratic state of all its people and not a Jewish halacha state. I think that as we approach this 73rd birthday, the understanding that voices like my own bring with us, the insights that we have, the understanding of the imperative to propel Israel forward to the next 73 years in a way that is sustainable. Those voices are very, very important. And it is in no small part due to my Canadian values and identity, of course, the shared values between Canada and Israel, but my Canadian identity that has really enabled very, very fruitful discussion. And maybe we can talk about that, a little bit later, how that's come to play in the various committees that I have sat on in this outgoing Knesset.
I do have to ask you, as an Israeli Canadian, what do you think is the biggest difference in the mentalities between the two countries? I mean, I think I know the answer to that, but I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
So, I mean, we could talk about it even in the context of COVID-19, right? Sure. And the vaccine rollout. So when somebody first asked me, how is it that Israel is so successful at this vaccine rollout? It is probably the biggest difference between Canada and Israel that enabled Israel to be so successful. And that would be that informality. So literally, and informality that comes with the flexibility, right? So literally, when there were vaccine portions left at the end of a day in, a nurse's office somewhere in, name a city or name a small town in the state of Israel, the nurse stuck her head out the window and said to the guy at the bus stop, hey, you want to get your vaccine? And there was not one vaccine wasted, not one portion that was not used that day. And so that is probably sort of, obviously just a manifestation and a little bit anecdotal, but that kind of informality, the flexibility that enables us, for better and worse, and we can talk about the worse soon too, because that of course does not go hand in hand with the kind of long-term planning that I was referring to a little bit before, that I believe a sovereign country has to also know how to do. But that is probably the most sort of prominent difference, something that stands out in everything that, my own children experienced, right? You bring Canadian children to the state of Israel, and within 5 minutes, they have that kind of independence that comes from that informality, that sort of have to roll with the punches, that have to begin, sort of fending for themselves. And they can, because everybody else does as well. So those are really primary differences. As I said, they have their advantages and they have their disadvantages, and seeing them from the outside in. So being able to identify and maybe maximize the advantageous part of it, but also speak about the imperative for, as I said before, for a sovereign country to actually create sustainable long-term plans that can't always be, so informal, so flexible, that have to have some level of transparency, I would say full transparency to the public, in order to be able to keep public trust, especially again with COVID-19. I'm not, saying anything that everybody is not aware of. The importance of being able to address a pandemic, the importance of public trust is probably the most significant portion of how it is that different countries engaged with the challenges of this pandemic. They don't always go hand in hand with that sort of flexibility that I described before, Lauren.
Right. So, we'll get to the trust in the government and the establishment in just a second, but I want to ask you, you've touched on how your Canadian identity has impacted your work as a politician, but I wonder why you decided to go into public service in the first place.
So, look, I've served, both as a lawyer and a researcher and an academic in various capacities, but always with an eye towards public service. And I'll say that it probably has partly to do with being an Ola or an Ole to the state of Israel, and our commitment to make this place the best version of itself that it can be. So some of us are able to do that in the private sector, in the business sector, in the entrepreneurial sector, and some of us actually find ourselves in the public sector. I'll say that, throughout my time living in Israel, I always was involved with, non-for-profit organizations, whether as a board member, an advisory committee, and so forth, and as a lawyer. So if I had to, and I don't know if this has to do with my Canadian identity so much, but rather with my professional one, as a lawyer, as an international law specialist, as somebody who has sort of tracked the weaponization of international law and human rights and the way that that undermines and disempowers the state of Israel, I have actually been very, very engaged in the Golden Case and Cause. And for those that might not be familiar with it, nearly 7 years ago, at the peak of the Gaza war, Hadar Golden, 1 hour after an international humanitarian ceasefire was brokered by the US and the UN, by the way, supported by the EU. An hour after it was brokered, Hadar Golden was killed and abducted. He is still held in violation of international law, alongside another soldier, Oron Shaul, deceased as well, and 2 Israeli civilians, Avera Mengistu and Hisham Asayed. For the better part of nearly 7 years, we know nothing about the civilians. We know that the 2 soldiers, deceased soldiers, are being held by Hamas, all of them, as I said, in standing violation of international law, of resolutions passed by the Security Council, such as Resolution 2474. And having built the case and cause, we refer to as the case and cause because it's not singularly about Hadar Golden or the other deceased soldiers or the soldiers and the civilians together. It is really about the imperative for trustees of international law and human rights to ensure that those principles are upheld consistently towards all. And what we've seen here, and as I said, the US and the UN brokered that international humanitarian ceasefire. The EU supported that international humanitarian ceasefire, and we have heard nothing, neither from those countries. I mean, we have heard actually, because I accompanied the Golden family to the UN and we met with Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, and absolutely he iterated and reiterated, like many other foreign ministers of various countries who iterated and reiterated their commitment to international law and the imperative to return Hadar, Oron, Avera, and Hisham. Except that absolutely nothing has been done in order to ensure that international law is upheld, in order to ensure that human rights are not undermined in this way. And very specifically, again, COVID-19 having invented nothing but only exposed opportunities, COVID-19 has been a tremendous sort of looking glass through which to look at the paradigm shift that we have tried to create utilizing international law, and we call it humanitarian for humanitarian. So the state of Israel has its legal responsibilities, certainly towards those held in Gaza. Those have been very, very significantly lowered as the state of Israel left the Gaza Strip, as everybody is probably aware, and no longer has responsibility for internal issues, medical care, and so forth. But in this case, what the state of Israel has done way, way beyond the call of justice and way beyond the call of international law is, for example, supply vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines to Gaza. Now, when we talk about that sort of beyond the law or beyond the call of duty, humanitarian aid, and I am proud to live in a country that actually provides humanitarian aid beyond the call of duty. But that humanitarian aid is also an opportunity to demand the application of the principle of reciprocity, a principle of international law that says, yes, we have humanitarian needs as well. Our humanitarian needs are in the form of 2 deceased soldiers and 2 civilians. Now, if I talk a little bit about the countries that are donor countries to the Gaza Strip, that are responsible for the educational or the publication of educational materials that go into the Gaza Strip, they too are accountable and can be held to account for the application or the lack of application of international law and human rights. And so when I entered Knesset, I would say that if I had to choose one single issue that made me realize that I need to be around decision-making tables in order to challenge paradigms, flip equations, bring the language of international law into the discussion, not only affirm international law, but utilize the language of rights, the lingua franca spoken around the world. Frankly, if you don't speak the language of rights, and I'm not talking about English, the language of rights is spoken by both Israel's friends and foes, and we need to utilize it in order to explain the very same things that we explain very often utilizing the language of security, which means nothing to the majority of countries or peers around the world. And that, as a parliamentarian, has been my focal point when it comes to Israel's international relations, in addition to this case and cause, I should say that for the first time I was appointed to be the liaison on the issue of the ICC, which just rendered its decision, once again, directly connected to the weaponization of international law and the use of it in order to undermine Israel's very legitimacy, very right to exist.
So just to clarify, until today, there has been no progress in returning these soldiers' bodies or these civilians from the Gaza Strip.
So there has been zero progress. There has been not even information about them. And I should say about the two civilians, we know that they both actually wandered into Gaza, both mentally challenged. And there has been not even an attempt by, for example, international institutions and organizations such as the Red Cross to demand to know their whereabouts. Now, that is a violation of international law. And we need to be able to reiterate that in every stage of the international institutions that are mandated to uphold, protect, and ensure that those values are in fact respected.
All right, a lot of things to discuss, a lot of hot issues going on in this country, but let's get to the biggest news of these past couple of weeks. Of course, the Israeli elections, our fourth election in this country in 2 years, which to everyone watching probably sounds insane. Some of our viewers might not necessarily understand what exactly is going on in the details here. So Michal, perhaps you can explain for us what has brought Israel to a fourth election. Why can't we make up our minds?
So we'll begin like this. We'll say the following. 4 elections in 2 years is an unacceptable reality. It's unacceptable on so many levels because it leads to a state of dysfunction. I should add to that, there is no budget. A budget has not been passed in order to enable us to create the long-term solutions that I was referring to before COVID-19, and certainly not with the challenges of COVID-19. Now, those 4 elections in 2 years to me are, and this is the optimist in me or the hopeful sort of person in me that says the following, excuse me, bus just drove by, that says the following. We are a work in progress. The state of Israel, at nearly 73 years old, we're about to celebrate, the miracle that is the state of Israel. 73 is very young for a democracy. And I say this to Canadians, at 73, I believe Canada still had residential schools. We have to get it right and we have to do better, but we are in a process. And that process looks like a lot of what I referred to before. What does a sovereign state of Israel that is Jewish and democratic, founded upon the principles of the Declaration of Independence? By the way, one of the first laws that I managed to submit in this last Knesset, of course it didn't pass because we just didn't have enough time, is the Basic Law Declaration of Independence, based on my understanding that at first we need to renew the covenant and understand that that's what this country is. The values that are anchored in the Declaration of Independence, the speak of an indigenous people returning to its ancestral homeland, and of course, of the equality that it ensures to all of its minorities alongside that speaks of this state of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, with a responsibility that brings with it, that speaks of the very legitimacy of the state of Israel to exist as a country among the family of nations. It speaks to all of that. All that is in the Declaration of Independence. And if I had to say, that the imperative to reaffirm those values is so important. They were never anchored into law, and it enables us to actually have the discussion of the issues we have not yet discussed. And I believe that the 4 elections in 2 years are a part, or at least a symptom of our sort of challenges as we look ahead, of the issues we have not spoken about. What does it mean to be a Jewish and democratic state? What does that look like in terms of the various denominations of Judaism? What does it look like in terms of the challenge to conversion issues, to Shabbat in the public sphere? What does it look like in our relationship as the majority with the minorities that live in the sovereign state of Israel? What does it look like vis-a-vis our relationship with diaspora communities? And that to me is very, very important. And so in many ways, and of course, I haven't touched upon the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that in addition to all of the issues that we need to be discussing, and we are not discussing, and by the way, 4 election campaigns, very little vision, very little issues, mostly the elephant in the room. Yes, Bibi, no, Bibi. So yes, Benjamin Netanyahu, sitting prime minister for the state of Israel for more than a decade, or no, it's time for change. Now, of course, legally speaking, that is not something that Israeli law, calls for. There is no term limitation currently in the state of Israel. There is no demand that the prime minister relinquish his, leadership after X number of years or for X number of reasons. There isn't even a law that stipulates that a sitting prime minister that has allegations, of possible indictments against him has to resign from his position. Actually, the law says quite the opposite. A sitting prime minister can remain the sitting prime minister. And so I think that the combination of the intersection of the challenges, the issues that I raised before, with the very, very stark reality that we have had a sitting prime minister, and there are people who love him and there are people who can't stand him and would like to see him go. That is what has led to this sort of deadlock for elections in under 2 years. It's a very, very uncomfortable position to be in. As some of you may know, I excused myself from running in this last election because, for many reasons, but primarily because none of the platforms enabled me to serve the constituency that I referred to before, to know that I can advance the issues and sound the voices that I am committed to sounding, because we're not talking about any of that. We're only talking about yes, Bibi, or no, Bibi. In this fourth election, it was really, really pronounced. And I'll say very, very frustratingly that, in fact, the Israeli public is ready for these discussions. I would argue that the majority of Israelis are somewhere in what's called the center, or are moderates. And in this process, a fourth election campaign in 2 years, what that has forced politicians or the political leadership to do is actually sharpen the differences, hone in on everything that separates us rather than focus on what unites us. And in many ways, that is why I joined Blue and White, specifically because I truly believe that what unites us far, far outweighs what divides us. And I would argue that 80% of us agree about 80% of the issues, 80% of the time. And by the way, the 20% is very likely us talking to ourselves without a partner, because it's mostly about the Palestinians, us talking to ourselves about what we disagree about, which at the moment, sadly, I say this really honestly, sadly, seems to be irrelevant. And actually, I say seems to be because the Abraham Accords, and we can talk a little bit about that too, because alongside COVID, we've had this tremendous year, which we should not sort of forget to both understand deeply, understand the potential of, and make sure that we maximize. And maybe we'll talk about the Abraham Accords and how they affect the internal discourse in the state of Israel with Israel's Arab population and the potential that's there, and also paves the path forward with peoples in the region, including with the Palestinians, based on what happened very clearly, or the potential paradigm shift of the Abraham Accords, namely the shift away from rejectionism to normalization, based on the pivot from the 3 no's of Khartoum: no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, no to peace with Israel, to the 3 yeses: yes to recognition, yes to negotiation, yes to peace with Israel, in that order. And recognition, though it seems very basic, recognition of the other, to exist as who they are, in Israel's case, as the Jewish and democratic state that it was founded to be 73 years ago, that is an incredible path forward, not only with Bahrain and the UAE and Morocco and Sudan, but potentially with countries we already have peace with, such as Egypt and Jordan, and certainly with peoples of the region, including with the Palestinians. And what we have before us is actually a path forward that says, yes, there are some preconditions. Recognition as a precondition, that's not a huge precondition. I recognize your right to exist as who you are. And then that enables the negotiation, which paves the path to sustainable, long-lasting peace. And that's what we've seen happen. And that is where we need to lead this forward, including with the Palestinians, as I said, and certainly turning the mirror internally. And maybe we'll touch upon this too, in what's happened in terms of Israel's Arab-Jewish relations within the state of Israel, Israel's Arab minority. And we see that as a result of this last election as well, which is fascinating. And we would be remiss if we did not empower the voices of moderation, first recognize, of course, the voice of moderation, and empower them in order to pave the path forward here as well.
Wow, so many big issues to talk about that you just brought up. I don't want to get too far from the elections just yet. So up until, I would say, the third election in this 4-election round, you mentioned the elephant in the room, Netanyahu. His, most possible challenger, biggest challenger, had been Benny Gantz and his Blue and White Party. And you did serve under Benny Gantz as a member of Knesset. So I'd like you to speak a little bit about, you mentioned why you joined Gantz's Blue and White, but what happened throughout that process, and why in the end did you decide not to run with that party? And do you think that Gantz has any chance in the future of ever being a challenger to Netanyahu again?
So I'll try and give you a little bit of my analysis of what happened in terms of Blue and White's joining. And I should mention that I joined Blue and White. Blue and White was an amalgamation of 3 separate parties. I joined Blue and White with Telem. There were 3 parties: Telem, Yesh Atid, and Chosen L'Israel. Benny Gantz was the head of Chosen L'Israel, and we joined together to form Blue and White. And I'll speak about my perspective that I touched upon a little bit before. I joined Blue and White committed to, first and foremost, creating an alternative, not saying what we are not, but saying what we are, primarily committed to unity, not uniformity. Unity and the imperative to create an internal resiliency to the Israeli fabric of society, whether that be Jews and Arabs, religious and secular, ultra-Orthodox and whatever else. And as far as I was concerned, the imperative for an engagement with diaspora communities, and the importance of addressing Israel's challenges in terms of its legitimacy in the international arena. And the only way, as far as I'm concerned, to do that is actually to be able to speak in the voices of moderation that I've referred to before. That's what Blue and White was for me. That is why I joined Blue and White. When you ask me what happened, I can tell you, as you know, Lauren, that when Benny Gantz, after 3 election campaigns and faced with the beginning of COVID-19, we didn't even know where it would lead to. We didn't know the tremendous challenges that it would pose. Really the most significant health and economic and mental health challenges and ones that we didn't know to anticipate. When Benny Gantz made the decision that he was entering a unity government because there was no other government that could be formed, actually the first weakening of Blue and White, if you ask me, is when Yesh Atid and Telem, to me, very sadly, made the decision not to join the unity government. I was a proponent of joining the unity government. I believed that that was what the public expected of us, and that the responsibility that led us to form Blue and White, committed to unity, to internal resiliency, that very same responsibility had to lead us into this unity government, especially in the shadow of COVID-19. To me, the first sort of loosening of what held Blue and White together was when Yesh Atid and Telem decided not to join, not to follow Benny Gantz's lead. And that was really the first weakening or undermining of the potential that Blue and White brought with it as something that would present or create or enable that alternative that I spoke about before. Then we really entered a stage of quite a dysfunctional government. And I'll say, I entered Knesset with what's known as, it's a very Israeli version, of course, as usual, what's known as the Norwegian law. In Norway, because of separation of powers, all ministers resign and the MKs on the list below them sort of enter the parliament. Well, in our case, 5 ministers resigned, 5 MKs entered the Knesset to serve as parliamentarians because there simply weren't enough hands on deck when Blue and White fell apart. And that is how I entered Knesset. I'd say that then there was a series of challenges internally to Blue and White, but mostly in terms of the lack of trust of this unity government that was formed. And I don't like much to play the blame game, but at the end of the day, the most significant piece is that there was a budget that was supposed to be passed by this unity government. And the only way that this unity government, which again, the coalition agreement was a very sophisticated agreement. It was basically an agreement that enabled a rotation for prime ministership midway in, next November, in fact. And the only way that that agreement would collapse and that basically the Knesset would disperse itself is what in fact happened. And that is that we would not pass a budget. And we did not pass a budget. And that is an acute moment of a breaking of the public's trust. And I'll tell you, and you mentioned before that I sat on a lot of committees. I was also the chair of the Drug and Alcohol Use Committee. Everywhere that I touched, but everywhere, whether it's addiction centers or programs or the funding for the communities that then, accompany former addicts, everywhere I touched, we were completely and irresponsible. I'm not part of the government, but irresponsible in that the government was unable to pass a budget. So irresponsible that it's at the point of dysfunctionality, as bad as elections were, an option, much worse was the dysfunctionality of the government, knowing that we cannot pass a budget. We cannot address the challenges, whether they be COVID-19 related or whether they just be regular challenges of what the health ministry requires and the education ministry requires and the work between the ministry requires. Dysfunctionality was really at keeping the country from being able to move past all of the challenges that were very, very clearly in demand of a functioning government. And I, in fact, supported at that point the dissolution of the current government and heading back to elections for the sovereign, to the people, to say their sort of final word. Except that, Lauren, as you said, the sovereign has said their final word, and we are still at a stalemate. And I'm not much of a predictor. There are creative solutions, and as you know, I did not run in this current election. So I try and really make sure that I say this in the most objective way possible. The state of Israel needs a stable government. It needs a stable government. And there are creative solutions that will enable the construction of a stable government. But an unstable government is not something that we can handle right now. And all kinds of, discourse and discussions and ideas about a minority government that will last for a very limited time, that will not be able to function, is simply not acceptable. There have to be, the kind of responsibility that has to be taken by all the political leaders of the various parties that have really made this very, very personal. So the personalization of it is really dramatic. But now is the time to step up and transcend differences and to create, or to find those creative solutions to create that sort of stable government that will enable, at least for the next couple of years, to lead past the challenges that we currently face.
So I know you want to be objective and you don't want to say too much, but I'm curious what you mean by creative solutions.
Look, I mean, some of them have even, sort of been mentioned by the press, and, the possibility that the head of quite a small party, Benny Gantz or Naftali Bennett, both having, 8 or 7 mandates, which is really a very, creative solution, I would say this. But if the assumption is that the majority of the parties would be able to accept their premiership, as opposed to, let's say, Benjamin Netanyahu or Yair Lapid for that matter, then it is going to have to be, and time will tell, and very short time will tell, because as you know, the president will next week assign the attempted construction of a government to the leader of a party that is most likely to be able to construct a coalition government. So the creative solutions, yeah, they range from that, and they include, for example, a lot of discourse of the support of I don't know how technical I want to get with this, but the Joint Arab List has in fact splintered, and we have an Islamic party headed by Mansourabus. And anecdotally, I'll tell you that he was a member of my committee. So on Sunday mornings, Michal Cotler-Wunsh walked around addiction centers with Mansourabus, Yossi Tayyib from Shas, and Eliyahu Baruchi from Agudat Israel. And if I tell you at the end of the day, and people are not familiar with the real work that happens in the committees, if I tell you that what bound us together was far greater than anything that set us apart, because we realized that we were dealing with all of our children or with all of our adults when we were walking around addiction centers, Arabs and Jews, religious and secular, as I mentioned before, ultra-Orthodox and, completely not. And those are the opportunities. And so Mansourabus, as I said, has broken off from the Joint Arab List, has passed the electoral threshold. And there are many discussions, as you know, about the implications of that. Is this an outstretched hand for an integrationist approach of Israel's Arabs? Is this the mirror of the Abraham Accords that I mentioned before, where I don't know if our viewers or listeners are aware of this, but even during COVID-19, tens of thousands of Israelis traveled to the UAE, and a half of them were actually Arab citizens of the state of Israel. So that sort of, just as as an anecdote, that wish to integrate in the state of Israel, that understanding that they are a part and want to take part and want to lead, which Mansourabus seems to represent, the focus on civilian issues. And I'll tell you, it's not simple. It's not simple, because when tasked with the question, do you acknowledge Israel's right to exist as what it is, Jewish and democratic, I'm not sure how Mansourabus would answer to that. And so those are part of the challenges, as I said, that A, we have to deal with as a country and a society, and B, are really at our doorstep as the possible creative solutions that will force us to, for better or worse, create a coalition that will ultimately be having those discussions, whether we like it or not. Would I like to be leading them in a more of truth and reconciliation type of way? Yes. Is this the best possible way for us to be reaching the stage of having these conversations? I would argue no. But are we there? Are we at the intersection where we are pushed into having these very difficult conversations? Yes.
So speaking of Mansourabus, just to expand on what you were saying, part of the reason that his party did break away from the other Arab parties running the Knesset was because he said that he would in fact support Netanyahu and possibly sit with Netanyahu in a coalition, which is very rare for the head of an Arab party to actually admit. Now, do you think that at the end of the day, it's possible that he will sit in a coalition with Netanyahu? And just to clarify also one other thing that you said, the electoral threshold in Israel, we use that term to describe the number of votes that the parties are getting, because they have to get more than 3.25% of the votes in order to make it into the Knesset at all. So Mansourabus's party did pass that threshold, and he will be going to the Knesset. So do you think that it's possible that that is a coalition that could happen, even though the more extreme right-wing parties that will sit with Netanyahu potentially have said that they will not sit with an Arab party? So how do we see that playing out?
So, time will tell, first of all. But is it possible? Yes. I think that Mansourabus took a very pragmatic line and said the following: I'm in nobody's pocket. I'm not into this right or left. It doesn't matter to me. Whichever of the coalitions, offer me more for my constituency, and I spoke before about my constituency, I'm going to service my constituency, Israeli Arabs. And right now, and maybe our viewers aren't aware, but there is a huge challenge of crime in the Arab sector, of domestic violence in the Arab sector. And Mansourabus has made the commitment to address that issue. It's completely a civilian issue. It has nothing to do with ideology of politics or the Palestinian issue, or any of the ideological sort of references that I made to before about the identity of the state of Israel. Is it Jewish and democratic state of all its people? He's saying that is not at all my concern. I am going to go with whoever it is that offers me more for my constituency, who I can advance in a more concrete way, whether it's education or professional advancement, or as I said, or combating crime in the Arab sector. That is the commitment he made. And so, is it possible from his perspective? I would argue yes. Will it be possible with the situation that we're in terms of the coalition, deal making? And this is where I'm a little saddened by this, because I'm not saddened because I'm very hopeful, and maybe I always quote the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in his differentiation between hope and optimism, and maybe this would be the moment to explain why I'm hopeful. And he said the following. He said, optimism is the belief that everything is going to be okay, whereas hope is the belief that we have to make it okay. In that sense, optimism is quite a passive virtue, whereas hope is very, very active. And it takes no courage at all to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to be hopeful. And so when I use the word hope and have a deep sense of hope, it comes with a tremendous sense of responsibility. And the place where I'm a little bit sad, though hopeful, is what I referred to before. Here we are in a process where we could have been possibly talking about, at least less parties of a system. I won't even say a two-party system or a three-party system like that we're familiar with in the United States or in Canada, but a 37-party system. Now, in the foundation of the state, or with the foundation of the state, there was really sort of an understanding that each sector had to be represented, because we were all so different. We were coming from different cultures and different backgrounds and different needs, and we needed that kind of representation. But in this process that I referred to before, in this work in progress that we are in, I would argue that we are getting closer and closer to being able to at least limiting the number of parties and finding ourselves within a range of, and that's what blue and white was to me, within a range of viewpoint diversity that can agree on the majority of the time, the majority of the issues. We came very close to that, and now we've sort of taken a turn back to that very sectorial representation. Now, that's natural because change is difficult, but Mansourabus and the constellation that will enable or not enable his inclusion in the coalition, or by the way, there's even talk of him not being actually included in the coalition, but just supporting the coalition from the outside. That is going to be a part of this process that we're in, and we will see how that pans out very, very soon.
Just really briefly, I want to ask you about something that you just mentioned. You said that Mansourabus is really dedicated to sort of quelling the violence in Arab-Israeli society, when in fact, a lot of that violence has erupted while Netanyahu was in power, while Netanyahu was the prime minister. So how can you rationalize going to sit in a coalition with Netanyahu when he didn't really put an end to the violence that he's campaigning for?
So, again, this is why I really prefer to depersonalize. It should be that the Likud actually has allotted and apportioned a larger budget for combating violence in the Arab sector than any other government before. But to me, we're making a colossal mistake when we focus only on crime and domestic violence in the Arab sector. To me, this is about governance, good governance, or rather bad governance. It's about accountability. It's about, the ability of a sovereign country to take responsibility for crime. And by the way, it's not just in the Arab sector. We would really be remiss if we treated it as that. And that is sort of the flagship that, yes, Mansourabus has focused on in terms of his own constituency. But I care about the crime in the Arab sector as much as I care about anything, certainly in representational politics of the kind that I try to serve as. I don't sense less of a responsibility to, crime in the Arab sector than I do to crime in any other sector. We'll say that. And I think that the holistic approach to this and the understanding that the state of Israel must learn to take responsibility as a sovereign country. And I keep using the word sovereign because I don't think that sovereignty is something we should take for granted. I think as a people that was exiled for millennia, that did not have sovereignty, and by the way, that historically, and we just, we're in the midst of Passover, and we talk over and over again about the journey to freedom and the journey to sovereignty and how difficult those are. I truly think that this is something, by the way, in terms of engagement with diaspora, it's very important as well, because this is our collective understanding of what it means to be a sovereign country after millennia of being exiled from the ancestral homeland, which we return to, and having to take responsibility for the majority as the majority and for the minorities living in this sovereign country. That lack of sovereignty, by the way, comes into play with what I spoke about before, with a relationship that we have both with our foes outside of the state of Israel, for example, with Gaza. So sovereignty looks like something that the state of Israel has to take very seriously. And we understand that when rockets are fired, then that's a breach of sovereignty. But when balloons fly overhead and they happen to be incendiary and they burn down, thousands of acres, or kites, and child's play becomes, vehicles for terror, and that doesn't immediately sound all the alarms or the sovereignty alarms, then that's something that we're in together. That's something that we need to address as part of a much larger issue than, what I spoke about before, namely crime in the Arab sector.
Okay, Michal, I have to ask you this because honestly, I don't know the answer to this question. But now that we've had 4 elections, and this 4th election could also end in political deadlock, which would send us to a 5th election and maybe to a 6th election. Where does this cycle end? How do we get out of this cycle if we have the same result every time?
Okay, remember I said I'm a very hopeful person. So the first thing I want to say is I very, very much hope that this election, and I don't think a 5th election is something we should even iterate. I don't think we should consider it one of the options. I think the moment that and because words have meaning, the moment that and by the way, the media has over and over sort of represented that as a real option. It should not be a real alternative. A responsible elected leadership of all parties must find the way to create a stable government for the sake of the entire Israeli public. As I said before, Jews and Arabs, secular and religious. I don't think that we should be talking about 5th elections as a real option. And I believe that at this point, the majority of the political leadership understands that very, very well. And so I would like to focus on that and to assume that there will be some sort of a resolution of this, even if it's not as long term as I'd like it to be, even if the government does not live out its full 4 years, that it will have enough of a stability to lead us out of, or this, not lead us out of COVID-19, because I think we're going to be living with COVID-19 for years to come, and certainly with its implications, but at least take us to the step forward in terms of, the passing of the budget that's necessary to address the economic challenges that we face, the opportunities alongside the challenges in education and healthcare and so forth that we spoke about before. If not, then going to another election is very, very dramatic. I think that in terms of, and we spoke a little bit about public trust before, and we see when we look around the world, this is the sad part. The sad part is, a little bit what I said before, generally the Israeli very politically savvy public is actually quite moderate. There are extremes, don't get me wrong, but the extremes are the minorities. And in fact, what we see over and over again is that those minorities keep getting empowered and their voices keep getting louder. And we see that all over the world. We haven't talked about the way that this, or Israel's challenge, intersects with the global processes that we see all over the world. But in fact, they definitely play into it. And I truly hope that the current leadership of all of the parties will take responsible care and create some sort of a stable coalition agreement.
All right, we're getting to the end of our hour very soon, which is insane. I can't believe how fast time flew. But I do want to sort of get back to the elephant in the room that we were talking about before. And I wonder if you have any predictions, or if you don't like to make predictions, what you think would be the ideal next prime minister for this country? Who could replace Netanyahu? Or in other words, what kind of person could you see being the next leader for this country?
I don't know if we know that next leader yet. I don't know that we know to name that next leader. And I'll say that what I see so far, and it's where I've really had a challenge. And again, as I said, part of the reason that I excused myself from this last election campaign, I don't think that we see the voices that we need to be seeing in terms of leadership that has the ability for nuanced discussion, to lead that very broad base of muscular moderates. And with the power of moderation, by the way, comes tremendous responsibility. When I talk about the voices of Olim, for lack of a better word, and maybe this lets us circle back to where we started, that have the ability to look at Israel from the outside in. I think that those voices are currently very much missing around decision-making tables. I think that there is a very singular way. You know, I also sat in the Defense and Foreign Relations Committee, so there it's only a military purview. And the Law Committee has a very certain politicized purview, where, as far as I'm concerned, when the law is politicized, it's actually undermined. And I think that at 73, a maturing country needs a leadership that has a much more nuanced ability, first of all, understanding, and ability to communicate with a much broader cross-section of Israeli society, not as an election campaign, but truly in order to engage in many of the processes that we are on the brink of, that we need to be engaging in, the discussions that we need to be having. And I noted some of them in terms of Israeli internal resiliency and Israel diaspora relations and Israel standing in the international arena. And just to touch upon, you know, I led a couple of actually 4 hearings in the Aliyah and Klita Committee, and as actually as the chair of the subcommittee for Israel diaspora relations, I also invited communities to speak inside the Knesset, to allow the Knesset members to hear about the challenges of the communities instead of talking to them, hearing from them. The hearings that I'm referring to, 4 hearings held about the imperative to combat online anti-Semitism, actually led to the formation of an international interparliamentary task force to combat anti-Semitism. And when I talk to my peers, parliamentarians from around the world, from the UK and Canada and the US and Australia, and New Zealand will be joining as well, we recognize together that many of the challenges that we've talked about today, in terms of, you know, in the way that they've played out in Israeli politics, and that's without the elephant in the room. Many of the challenges are global challenges. Those processes intersect with internal Israeli challenges, of course, as well. And you know, with the existing challenges, political challenges of the state of Israel. But the next leadership of this country has to be able to zoom out and see the state of Israel in a much wider lens and in context of not only our own internal issues, which in fact do have to be addressed, but as they interplay, as they intersect with all of the other challenges. And of course, the imperative to engage with diaspora. I think that we have an opportunity and an obligation to actually engage with a relationship paradigm between Israel and diaspora. And COVID-19, again, has presented that opportunity, even in terms of, you know, the kind of relationship that we look to in order to ensure that we have a continued sustainable relationship with diaspora as we look at the challenges that communities, and, you know, I know Toronto, but certainly communities all over Canada, the United States, but also communities, and we should be very well aware, much smaller communities than those in North America that face tremendous challenges, that don't know how they'll survive this process, that know that schools are shutting down and community centers are shutting down. What's Israel's role in that? So I would expect the next leadership, as we approach, you know, sort of, I'd say this part of the process is unclear, but the next generation of leadership, to be a generation of leadership that can actually build, if the founding mothers and fathers built the physical infrastructure for this country, can build the, let's call it the spiritual infrastructure of this country as one that is turning 73.
And one last really quick question. Are we going to be seeing you back in the Knesset fighting for these issues?
So that is my complete commitment. I am going to identify the best ways to return to Knesset. At the end of the day, the way to change policies, to affect decisions, to sit around the decision-making tables for the process and for the ultimate decisions is to be there in Knesset, and I'm committed to return.
Wonderful. Michal, thank you very much. That was a really fun-filled and information-filled hour. Now I think Gail maybe has a couple questions from the crowd.
Actually, you guys answered a lot of the questions that we received. I want to thank both of you for this quite informative, in-depth, and unique perspective on Israeli politics. And it was just fascinating. And I know we're all just trying to absorb all the information. So thank you once again for joining us from Israel, and Chag Sameach to everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everyone. Thanks a lot.